Hi, it's Jody Medell, Doctor of Physical Therapy and Transformational Coach, back for session number 2 of our trauma and healing discussion. And the goal of all of this is that we feel safe coming home to each and every one of us. So coming home to the self, coming home to an open heart of love and light so we can reside there in a safe, peaceful way with joy. So that is our goal on this deep dive and this journey together. So today we're going to talk about traumas, different types of traumas. Last week I brought up signs and symptoms that you may be experiencing due to the traumas that you've had in your life. And those 5 signs and symptoms were emotional dysregulation, negative self-concept, interpersonal difficulties, re-experiencing the trauma, and using behaviors of avoidance and numbing. And my challenge for you last week was to think about what these signs and symptoms are, and how you might be experiencing them. And if you are relating to any one of those. Today, when we talk about traumas, we're going to talk about 2 major groups of traumas, and then we're going to break it down. I want you to make a connection between the traumas you've experienced and the outcome of how you may embody them through your signs and symptoms. And if we can set a baseline of what that is, then when we get into the healing component, we can move forward. So my challenge for you after today is to take your signs and symptoms that you related to from the first video. Today you're going to look at the different types of traumas and see how they interconnect for you, where they come together, and just in your own mind or write it down what it is that you're experiencing, at what level, and hopefully what we'll see over the course of time is that this all changes for you in a positive direction. All right, so let's talk about different types of traumas. Again, I'm going to break trauma down into 2 categories. One is individual trauma, and the second is the collective or group traumas. We're going to do the deep dive into the individual. We're going to talk about the group, the collective traumas, but that's not going to be where our focus is. And again, within that group and collective trauma, individuals can experience trauma uniquely their own way, but we're not going to, again, that's just, we'll talk about it. I'm going to introduce you to it, but we want to talk about how traumas affect us individually. So within individual trauma, the first group that we're going to talk about, we have 3 major categories. We have acute trauma, we have chronic trauma, and we have complex trauma. Acute trauma is basically trauma that happens once, a major accident, like being in a motor vehicle accident. It's a one-time event, but it's so traumatic, we hold on to it. Depending on what we experienced during that event, we could get flashbacks. We could actually have physical symptoms from that motor vehicle accident. But it's, again, a one-time event. It's big, and it creates a major impact on our being, okay? The second type of trauma is chronic trauma. Chronic trauma is a trauma that doesn't just happen once, it happens over the course of time. So a chronic trauma could be neglect. Let's say as a child you're neglected, you're unloved by your parents. And so that trauma happens over the course of your life. And because of that neglect or because of that lack of love, you adopt certain behaviors. And that goes back to what we talked about in the last video of signs and symptoms. And you develop those as coping mechanisms for your experience of that chronic trauma over time. The third type is complex. So if you take the chronic trauma and you layer it, so you don't just have neglect, you also have sexual abuse, you have violence, you put that all together, you experience all of that over time, you end up with complex trauma. So that would, again, create, if we go back to video number 1, the signs and symptoms, probably more layered, probably more intense because the trauma is more intense over a long period of time, of what you're going to experience with those signs and symptoms. Okay, so the effect may be a bigger impact on how you exist in the world, how you present yourself, how you function. All right, and again, I want you to just take inventory of your signs and symptoms, how it may relate to the type of traumas you've been experiencing, so that as we move forward into healing, you can see how you're changing. An example of that would be dysregulation, emotional dysregulation. So let's say your emotions are all over the place. Things happen, you're in a panic, you're fine one minute, you're not the next. You go to the grocery store, you walked in just happy as a clam, and you, for whatever reason, all of a sudden you're angry. And so something happened in the environment, you might not even be aware of it, but it just shifted the way that you experience things emotionally. And so you're not a steady state, you're up and down and all around. And so those are the things we want to identify, write down, take an inventory of, so that we can see how that changes over time as we get into the healing journey, the healing portion of this video series. Okay, just to give some names, specific names to these types of traumas. So we've heard of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. I wanted to say syndrome, PTSD disorder. And PTSD is typically associated with more of an acute situation. So it's something big that happened. It created trauma in our system. And within PTSD, we have, again, the same signs, symptoms that we talked about. And there are specific techniques out there that address PTSD. And they're so effective because typically within this one-time event, we can isolate it, we can find it where it is in our body, where we're holding it, how we're feeling it. And with these techniques, then we can really tap into that specific trauma. Then there's another category or name, complex PTSD. So it's basically addressing the chronic and the complex traumas that we just talked about. And so complex PTSD has a different set of tools and techniques that are appropriate for it because it's not a one-time event, and it's a kind of the way we existed over a course of our time, pretty much in our developmental years. It needs to focus on the fact that we've had these repeated traumas over time. So the healing part of complex PTSD is just a little bit different than when we've had just a one-time event, one and done. All right, so that goes into the individual type of trauma. We also have the collective or group type of trauma. Within that, we have historical or intergenerational trauma. That's basically trauma that affects multiple generations over time. And that could be, what's a good example? How about slavery? So slavery happens, and because it's oppressive, and you're born into slavery, typically that then affects the next generation and the next generation. And so it becomes an oppressive way of life for those people who experience that. The next type is collective trauma. So trauma that happened to a group of people. So a good example is the fire that happened in Maui. And so a whole group of people were affected by that fire. They were kicked out of the land that they lived on. Their homes were gone, devastation. And so it affected not just one person, but it affected that entire community of people. And then there's cultural trauma. Cultural trauma is trauma that affects a cultural group of people. So let's look at the Native Americans, the oppression that they went under and continue to go under due to the loss of their land. So the land that they lived on was taken away from them, and they were pushed off of where they were, and they were forced, a different lifestyle was forced upon the Native Americans, right? And so that oppression, that just lack of respect to this whole cultural group force them into a trauma because of the way they were treated. So again, each individual is going to obviously be affected by the trauma, but you can categorize it by the collective because it happened to a whole group of people. So again, we have that intergenerational trauma, the collective trauma, and then the cultural trauma. All right, so what I want you to do again for your homework between now and we talk next time, where we start to do our dive into healing, is to think about the 3 different types of individual trauma, whether it be acute, whether it be chronic, or whether it be complex. Look at how PTSD relates to the acute and how complex PTSD relates to the chronic and the complex. And knowing those different types of traumas, take a look at your signs, your symptoms from the 5 groups we listed, and put that together and just create that baseline for yourself of what you're experiencing, why you might be experiencing it, because you know the types of traumas. And that will set the base so that as we move forward into healing, we'll have a scale that we can use to see our progress. So it's great to feel it, see it, just take the progress in on many levels, and this will give us a standardized baseline for each and every one of us, okay? So enjoy your homework. Enjoy the weekend. It's Labor Day weekend. My son and I are taking off for Salida, our last hoorah, I think, for the year. We're going to go mountain biking, hiking, trail running, play in the water. So it'll be a fun time. And I mention that because part of the healing process is enjoying life. It's getting out with nature. It's listening to your heart and letting your heart guide you to what it is that brings you joy, that brings you pleasure, brings you that sense of, this feels great. So that's something I do for me. I spend a lot of time with nature. And so I will include those journeys that I do for my own self-healing as part of this whole series. All right, again, have a great weekend. Happy Labor Day. We'll see each other next week. All right, thanks.